There's history here!
And here.
There's history there!
History is everywhere!
Before I get going, I just wanted to say that in preparing this talk, I've drawn my information from sources compiled by several other local historians. And without these sources, I would know very little about Frank Clark and would not have very much to say about his work. Now, my starting point was the biography written by Kay Atwood that accompanied an inventory of Frank Clark's structures that she and Gail Evans did for the Southern Oregon Historical Society in 1982. The full inventory and evaluation, along with the biography, can be found at the Historical Society's reference library. However, the listing of buildings designed by Clark can be accessed online through the Historical Society's website. I also found the survey of Medford's downtown commercial area and the National Register nomination of Ashland's downtown historic district by George Kramer very helpful in sorting out the details. And I relied on the National Register nomination of the South Oakdale district that Vicki Bryden put together also. And let's see. And then also, and I think there's somebody here in the audience who I know Vicki and probably George have relied on his work too, and that was Scott Clay. And then also Ben Truey has a wonderful website full of local history, and I drew on the building research that he had done, and that's available online too. So I just want to say that I'm grateful for all of these sources and the work that these other folks have done. Whether on a national or a local scale, certain natural or man-made features give a location its identity, its sense of place. They help define the character of an area, and this sense of place is enhanced by the history or the stories that connect these physical features to our own experiences and foster a feeling of attachment or belonging to the place. Because of the unique and appealing nature of some of architect Frank Clark's surviving buildings, I believe that his work over time has helped contribute to this sense of place in the Rogue Valley. Clark is probably best known for his graceful period colonial homes that reflect his neoclassical training in the Beaux Arts tradition. But he was actually quite diverse in his types and styles of structures that he designed. His homes also include Queen Anne, Craftsman, Spanish Colonial, Prairie Style, and Tudor. He also designed dozens of public and commercial buildings with classical, Mission, Chicago School, Art Deco, and Art Moderne styling. And he worked a lot in stucco and poured concrete. I think it's important to note that Frank Clark was not the only trained architect designing buildings in the Rogue Valley during the first half of the 20th century. Yet, he's the one that's best remembered. So why is that? Well, I think that there's several factors involved, combined together, that make Clark stand out. And first of all, he was good. He had professional training, and he did quality work, as did a number of other architects who worked here in the Valley. Secondly, he had the opportunity to design a number, but not all, of the more prominent buildings in this area. And maybe most significantly, he had longevity. Clark had staying power and was able to survive through the lean economic times, so that over his 40-plus year local career from 1902 to 1946, he built up a larger body of work than other architects who were here for shorter periods of time or may have been working for out-of-town firms to begin with. Now, Clark designed all over the Valley, but since I prepared this talk first to present last week in Medford and now here in Ashland, I've pretty well focused on just these two communities. Born at the end of the year in 1872, Clark lived his first 10 years in Greene, New York. That's in south central part of the state. He lived with his parents, Philetus and Carrie Clark, and an older brother also named Philetus. And in 1882, the family moved to Bayonne, New Jersey, where Clark began his architectural apprenticeship when he was 16. And first he worked for a man named Frederick Martinez Jr. and later worked for Arthur Curtis Longyear. Around 1890 or 1891, Longyear joined Oscar Thiel in New York City, and Clark went with him. A few years later, Longyear and Thiel separated, and Clark stayed with Thiel. And then in the 1920s, it's just interesting to note that Thiel published a book called How to Do Architectural Drawings, and he also taught at Columbia University. So just knowing this, we can speculate that Clark probably got good instruction from Thiel as he was being mentored. And let's see, then between 1894 and 1896, Clark attended night school at the Cooper Union, taking architectural classes. And the Cooper Union, if you don't know, that was a technical college offering architecture, engineering, and art classes. And during this time, he also worked in the office of two very prominent New York architectural firms, Robert Gibson and McKim, Mead & White. And here are a couple of examples of the kind of work that these two firms were putting out. Gibson was an Englishman. He graduated from the Royal Academy of Arts in London and designed a number of major buildings in Manhattan. And McKim, Mead & White were one of, if not the largest and best-known firms in New York. Much of their work was done in the Beaux Arts tradition, and they also served as a training ground for many young architects. And so it's not unusual to think that Clark also had a chance to work there. Overworked and exhausted by 1896, Clark was in poor health, so he left New York for California. And he spent the next year or so relaxing and recuperating, and then late in either 1897 or early 98, he joined the office of Frederick Roehrig, who was an established architect who practiced in Los Angeles and Pasadena. And it would have been here that Clark would have been exposed to the Mission Revival style that was popular in Southern California. And while he was working for Roehrig, they had already previously designed a famous hotel, the Hotel Green, and that's in, let's see if I can make this work. Okay, this is the hotel, but this is the annex, which Clark is supposed to have had designed or had input into it. And then in 1899, Clark was 26 years old, and he opened his own office in Los Angeles. And he began doing work for Ezra Bartlett, who was a Tucson entrepreneur. And amongst the work that he did for Bartlett was the Bartlett Hotel in Jerome, Arizona. And also, during this time, he met Bartlett's daughter, Pauline, or Lena, as she was called, and whom he married a few years later. Now, in 1902, Clark had a contract to design two buildings in at the Southern Oregon Normal School. And in this photograph, you can see there's two buildings, but I do not know that the building on the left, if Clark had anything to do with that, but I'm sure that the building on the right that he designed, because it has the date 1903 built into it. 30-year-old Clark married Lena in 1903, and by spring of 1904, they were building a home on Siskiyou Boulevard that Clark designed. It's now known as the Tavener House for the family that lived there after the Clarks. And here are a couple of interior shots. I don't know if these were taken when the Clarks lived there or the Taverners, but it still gives you an idea of what the interior was like. Over the next 3 years, Clark was busy designing business buildings and homes, mostly in Ashland, a few in Grants Pass. And then late in 1906 or early 1907, he sold his home to George Tavener and left Ashland for San Francisco. Now, I don't know why he left, but I can speculate that he probably went to San Francisco because there was a big demand and need for architects during the rebuilding process after the earthquake. But he didn't stay long in San Francisco. In June of 1908, Clark returned to Ashland to supervise the construction of the Elks Temple that he had designed. And once back in Ashland, he opened another office and settled permanently in the Rogue Valley. That same year, in 1908, he partnered with 3 others to plan, promote, and build an auditorium, which was an indoor swimming complex here in Ashland. And that opened in 1909 with 2 swimming pools, one for the men and one for the ladies. The pools were filled from natural mineral springs, and they had slides, high dives, and even trapeze rings. Now, I don't know how long Clark stayed involved with this project, but just 10 years later, the natatorium closed. And then the building was torn down in the late 1920s, and it was abandoned until the pools were abandoned then, until the 1940s, when the pools were renovated and opened as twin plunges. Maybe some of you remember and swam there. And the twin plunges then closed in the 1970s, and now the Ashland Food Co-op sits on the site of the pools. So maybe the pool was not a success, but by 1910, Clark's architectural business was thriving. The railroad had come to the Rogue Valley in 1883, and that gave access to eastern and foreign markets, allowing the local fruit industry to flourish. And promoters brought wealthy investors from the East and the Midwest who bought orchard land, and they invested in other businesses as well. And this large population influx created a high demand for housing and new businesses, especially in rapidly growing Medford. And it was a perfect time for Clark. And also in 1910 and 11, Clark partnered with another formally trained architect named Frank Forster. And so during that time, Clark continued to work out of his office here in Ashland, and he opened another office in Medford for Forster. And the two worked together on the Medford Hotel project and a few other projects, but Forster didn't stay very long. So by the end of 1911, he had returned to New York City. And about that time then, Clark closed his Ashland office and moved to Medford and worked out of Medford from that time on. In 1911, Clark and Lena built this home that Clark designed on Summit Avenue in Northwest Medford. And some years later, they were divorced, and Lena stayed in this house for the rest of her life. In 1924, Clark married Grace Wilson. She was 24 and he was 51. And the couple had 4 children, Frank Jr., Louise, Ed, and James. And Clark also adopted Frances Verlaine, who was a daughter that Grace had had by a previous marriage. Until 1931, the Clarks lived in a somewhat nondescript remodeled house that they owned on West 10th Street in Medford. Then they moved to Clark's dream house, a spacious period colonial on East Main Street in Medford. And Clark had designed a number of homes in this posh East Medford neighborhood around Barnaburg, Berkeley, Crown, East Main. And now he had a home designed expressly for his young family. But the Depression was having an effect, and the economy had slowed, and there were fewer demands for new buildings. Business dropped off, and Clark couldn't afford to stay in the house. So he rented it out to Glenn Jackson, who later bought it. And the Clarks then moved to Grace's family home in Jacksonville, which was the Wilson House. And ironically, in the 1980s, this house was used by the Southern Oregon Historical Society for their exhibits department. And the Clark's daughter, Louise, gave an oral history interview, and in that she talked about the vegetable garden that they had here, and that her mother cooked on a wood stove. And when they first moved in, they didn't even have indoor plumbing, but that was soon added, and her father also added a home office. And you may be familiar with the backyard mining phenomenon that went on in Jacksonville during the Depression. People would actually dig gold mines in their yards and then tunnel under other buildings and roads and such. Well, the Clarks were part of this. Frank Clark hired a miner to work a mine in their yard, and the miner lived in a little cabin that was on their property. And I remember that there was a vacant lot next to the Wilson house, and we had a cave-in at one time in that little area, so maybe it was his. Let's see, oh, I'm not quite ready for that. So eventually, the Clarks moved back to their house on 10th Street and in Medford. And then at some point, Grace and Frank divorced, and she stayed in the 10th Street house. And it's kind of vague where Clark lived after that until he finally moved in with his daughter Louise, who had by that time grown up and lived on Grape Street. And maybe sometimes he was actually staying in his offices, but as I said, that's kind of vague to know exactly what was going on there. And in 1932, Clark took in a young architect named Robert Keeney. And Keeney was a year out of architectural school. He attended the U of O in Eugene, and he was working for a man named Bert Theroff, who was the owner of the Big Pines Lumber Company, and Keeney was doing spec houses for him. And he also worked for Clark at night because he had to get in so many hours working as an understudy with a licensed architect, and so he continued to work with Keeney that way until 1937, when Keeney actually did get his license, and then at that time he became a full partner with Clark. So between 1937 and 1942, the firm was known as Clark and Keeney. And I consider Keeney as part of Clark's legacy because he was mentoring Keeney along the way Clark had been mentored by these other New York architects. And so I think that we can kind of see some of his influence in Keeney's work too. But when the United States got involved in World War II, Keeney went into the service. So at that time they dissolved their partnership. And then when Keeney came back from the war, he was ready to resume the partnership, offered Clark a desk, whatever terms Clark wanted to work on, but he was 74 at the time and not in very good health, so basically he retired at that time. He might have done a project or two maybe for a friend, but I think we can consider Clark retired by 1946. Now, over Clark's long career, he designed a variety of buildings that reflect the economic and cultural development of the valley. To demonstrate this, I've organized a sampling of his works by themes that are related to historical events or activities. And there aren't too many buildings that relate to the railroad that Clark did, but he did do, as far as I know, this little exhibition building that's next to the railroad depot here in Ashland. And he also designed a home for Humboldt Pratt, who was the depot hotel manager at one time. And the railroad gave birth to the local orchard industry, which brought Clark a lot of business, designing elegant homes for orchardists in the outlying areas, like the Reginald Parsons home, Hillcrest. And you'll recognize that now as the Roxanne Winery. And he did in-town homes for packing house owners, like the Craftsman Bungalow for Ralph and Bertha Bardwell, or the Oregon Rustic Home for Joe Nama's family. And these two homes are almost across the street from each other in Medford's stylish South Oakdale district. Clark also designed several packing houses, including the distinctive Art Deco structure for the Bear Creek Orchards. Actually, this was done during the Clark and Keeney period. And Keeney continued to do work for Harry and David after Clark retired. Small lumber mills operated in Jackson County in the 19th century, but the Rogue Valley's timber industry really took off when the Owen family took over the Brownlee Olds Mill in north of Medford in 1924. And that mill then became Medco in later years. So Clark either designed or remodeled a house for the Owen family on East Main Street, but I don't have a photo of that. But he did do these two houses for Bert Theroff, the owner of Big Pines Lumber Company. And the first one, the one on the left, is in the Geneva, Minnesota Historical District. And then the one on the right is in the South Oakdale Historic District. Excuse me. And you'll remember the connection between Theroff and Keeney. It was Theroff who brought Keeney here to the valley to do his spec houses. And another lumber company owner that Clark designed for was George Porter. And Porter lived next door to Theroff on Minnesota, and they shared a driveway. And there's kind of a fun story that Roland Hubbard from Hubbard's Hardware told. Now, Roland lived across the street in another Clark designed house, but he told the story that Porter was the foreman for Theroff for about 18 years at Big Pines, but then he left and started his own company, and that kind of ticked Theroff off. So that might be part of the reason that he moved from the Geneva, Minnesota district to South Oakdale. I don't know if it's true, but it's kind of a fun story. So who can't relate to shopping? Clark designed a lot of retail spaces, including the Enders Building on East Main Street here. And that's an early example of the department store concept. There were individual shops, and they had doors that opened onto East Main, but they were all connected through interior doors so that customers could go from one store to the next without going outside. And there was a men's clothing and furnishing, there was ladies ready-to-wear and dress goods, a 15-cent store, a music department, a restaurant, confectioners, hardware and sporting goods, and a grocery store. And then in contrast, about the same time, Clark was commissioned by the city of Medford to design a public market, which was akin to our farmers markets today. It was billed as sanitary and well lighted, and every booth was connected with city water, and every stall was accessible from an exterior door. I'm sure that this was popular when it first opened, but by the end of the 1920s, it was failing, probably because there were more popular and convenient ways to shop. And by 1931, it was completely discontinued. Now, you may remember this building, the literal building at 6th and Bartlett in Medford, and it was torn down to make way for the Lithia headquarters in the Commons. But it opened in 1936 as a Safeway store, and that was to be ultra-modern in every respect. And you'll notice the distinctive finials. Those were actually saved when the building was torn down and incorporated into Pear Blossom Park. And in one of the oral histories that Keeney gave, he called those little finials turtles. And then when he was questioned about that, he said, well, Clark didn't invent this. He got the idea from another architect, John Tortolet, if I'm saying that correctly. And he was one of the designers that designed the Lithia Springs Hotel. And so he was referring to these as turtles or little tortolets, and then sometimes he also called them little Clarks, because it was something that Clark had adopted. And the big Y that was out there where Pacific Highway and Highway 62 come together, Clark was responsible for that. And just recently, Ben Truey actually came across a rather rare book of Oregon builders. And there were two images that were in that book that were attributed to Clark, and one was the Eugene Big Y, and I didn't even know that there was one in Eugene, but there was, and I guess he got credit for it. Although this would have been during the period of Clark and Keeney. Now, Clark also designed several city, county, and federal government projects. After previously designing an addition to an older Medford firehouse and city hall, Clark designed an all-new city hall built in 1927 and a fire hall built in 1929. And in 1922, he designed a number of buildings for the Jackson County Fair, which was located where the South Gateway is in Medford, basically where the Armory and Walmart are. And far from the charming houses on which Clark built his reputation, he also designed some bare-bones war housing. To help relieve the housing shortage, in Medford caused by the influx of defense employees during World War II, Clark was recruited to work on a federal housing project behind Jackson School. After the war, the apartments were administered by the Jackson County Housing Authority until they were torn down in 1957 to make way for the Santos Center and Jackson Pool. And Clark was also commissioned to do several medical buildings. He designed Ashland's Granite City Hospital in 1909 or 1910, and Southern Oregon University Stevenson Union now sits on the hospital site. And he worked on the community hospital in Medford, which was completed in 1927. And it's still there, but now barely recognizable as the Century Building on East Main Street. Clark also designed a number of schools in the area. In 1930, he was hired by the Medford School District to plan a new high school on South Oakdale and also a new Washington Elementary School on Peach Street. And you'll notice that there were similar styles, and they were both completed in 1931. Just as today, people in the past liked to have fun, and Clark also had a hand in designing buildings for recreation. Shortly after designing the natatorium here in Ashland, Clark did one for Medford, and that opened in 1910. And besides the huge swimming pool, it had a bowling alley, billiards room, shooting gallery, gym, skating rink, and a dance pavilion. And it was probably the social center in its heyday, but again, after time, it lost its luster late in the century, and it was torn down in 1956 to make way for a motel. And the inn at the Commons is now on that site. And then towards the end of Clark's career, Clark designed an ice skating rink in the Packing District in Medford. And that opened in 1941 in the fall, shortly before we became involved in World War II. And so it served not only the local residents, but it also provided a place for soldiers from Camp White to recreate. It's now a cold storage warehouse, and I believe it's owned by Sabrosa. Clark designed two of Medford's finest theaters, the Criterion in 1924 and the Holly in 1930. And as you know, the Holly is being restored now. And when the new Criterion was built, the curve of the front wall, the curve in front and the wall that faced Central Avenue were preserved as a nod to the old building. And here in Ashland, the Varsity was a product of Clark and Keeney. Actually, credit for the streamlined Art Moderne design goes to Keeney, who had recently achieved partnership. And churches were among Clark's projects, including the Temple of Truth, which once was located on Siskiyou Boulevard in Ashland, and the period Gothic Zion Lutheran Church in Medford, which is still owned and operated by the same denomination. And most likely, the First Baptist Church here in Ashland can be attributed to Clark, although we don't have strong documentation on it. But the Mission Style Revival speaks to Clark's style, and you'll recognize that as the Oregon Cabaret Theater. Death is a fact of life, and to address that reality, Clark designed several funeral homes, including a beautiful conversion of the Haffer home into the colonial revival-styled Pearl Funeral Home in Medford. That's now owned by the Episcopal Church, but I think it's for sale, so if anybody wants to buy it. And the mission-style Dodge & Sons Funeral Home here in Ashland was designed about the same time. The auto industry played a big role in Rogue Valley history. The introduction of the automobile was quickly embraced by Rogue Valley citizens. Jackson County was the first county in Oregon to have a paved road end to end. And at one time, Medford claimed to have more autos per person than any other city in the world. And of course, the Fortune 500 Lithium Motors Company started here in Ashland. Well, Riverside Avenue through Medford became known as Auto Row and was lined with dealerships and car-related businesses. And one of Clark's premier buildings, the Sparta Building, served the auto industry when C.E. Pop Gates leased it for an auto showroom and service garage in 1913. And later, the building held a Western Auto store. Around 1920, Gates moved his dealership into his own building that also was designed by Clark. This was at the corner of Riverside and 6th, where the parking structure is now. And in 1927, a second story was added following the same style, and it's presumed that Clark also did the second story. As the automobile became more popular, so did the idea of auto parks, campgrounds with tents or cabins catering to the auto tourist. Ashland's Lithia Park opened one such camp in 1915, and in 1924, Clark designed a community house for the camp. And the community house had a communal kitchen, restrooms, laundry, baths, and even a piano and dance floor. It now serves the city's Parks and Recreation Office. The Rogue Valley has a rich aviation history. The first airport in the state was Newell Barber Field, located at the South Gateway, probably closer to where Fred Meyer or the Harry and David store are now. And that was dedicated in 1920. And Clark may or may not have had something to do with those first initial buildings, but by 1929, Newell Barber Field was outgrown and a new airport built along Biddle Road, same location as our current airport, was built. And for the new airport, Clark designed the distinctive combination hangar and administration building and the United Airlines passenger depot. Now, if you're like me, you're always a little sad when you see old photos of the older brick buildings in Medford and Ashland with their 19th century detailing, and you wish that they still looked like that now. Yeah. Well, I have to tell you that Frank Clark had a hand in converting some of those beautiful buildings to the modernized, stripped-down stucco and tile-clad structures that we see today. And the Fleur Building, which sat on the site of Vogel Plaza before it burned in 1969, is a perfect example. Keeney remembered working on this project with Clark, and they moved their offices into this building when it was finished. And then they stayed there at least until Keeney left to serve in World War II. And you can see that the remodel consolidated two 19th century buildings into one, and it had retail space on the bottom and on the ground floor, and then offices on the upper floors. And the Stewart Building, also in Medford, at East Main and Bartlett, had wonderful bay windows, a turret, parapet roof line. And it's not known if Clark was responsible for removing the parapet and the turret, as the building was remodeled in 1921, and we don't know what exactly was done, and we don't know by whom. But a Mail Tribune newspaper tells us that a 1935 remodel by Clark included removal of the bay windows and an installation of a modern front, plate glass windows. And there may have been a few more changes since then, but overall, the look is quite similar today to that described in the newspaper in 1935. And the Hamlin Building, near the corner of East Main and Central, across from the U.S. Bank in Medford, also has gone through several remodelings. You can see that by 1906, the 1886 building had already lost its balcony. And the circa 1939 remodel that converted the facade to an Art Moderne style is attributed to Clark, or I should say Clark and Keeney. And Clark moved his office here when he left the Fleur Building. The front's been altered slightly in more recent years, but it appears much the same as when Clark was there. Clark also did remodeling in Ashland. Twice he did plans for the 1879 Masonic Hall, which is located on the Plaza. A 1909 remodel created a large main lodge room and a banquet room and a rear addition. I don't know that any alterations were made to the front at that time, but in 1928, Clark designed a third-story addition and a completely new facade with subtle classical look. And about the same time, Clark designed a makeover for the nearby Simpson building. This was a hardware store occupying two fronts that were a few doors closer to Main Street. And following Clark's plans, the old brick front was stuccoed, and the two-story bays, formerly connected by an interior archway, were combined into one large room. So as we go about our daily business, we may frequently pass by a building designed by Clark. As we do so, we may not always think about it, but just accept it as an integral part of our community. So how many of the following buildings designed by Clark do you recognize? Whoops, let me stay on this one. These two homes are within a block of each other along East Main Street in Medford. And the recently restored Sparta building is one of Clark's signature works. And you'll notice by the historic photo up top that originally the Elks Temple in Medford had a columned balcony on both sides. Don't we wish it still looked like that?
It's for sale now.
It's for sale. You want to buy that one too? Please, somebody.
Yes, restore it.
Mm-hmm. Now, this is one of my favorite buildings in Medford, although it's unclear how much Clark had to do with the design. It was built by a Portland contractor, and Clark worked with another architect on the project, R.W. Mastic. But Clark was named the supervising architect. And if you spend any time driving through downtown Medford, you should recognize these buildings and these. Although the original Medford Hotel burned to the ground in 1988, the fact that it was rebuilt using original Clark plans is a testament to how much the community valued this landmark building. And you'll, of course, recognize the iconic Harry and David packing house. And in Ashland, we have Carpenter Hall, owned by the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, that Clark designed originally as a Christian Science church. And the Elks Building, the Elks Temple, of course. And the Chapel Swedenborg House is now the Plunkett Center, home to the Southern Oregon University Foundation and Alumni Association on the SOU campus. And Dr. Swedenborg, a surgeon and founder of the Granite City Hospital, hired Clark to design a building on East Main Street where he had a medical office and his brother had a pharmacy. And like many other older brick buildings, it has been stuccoed over, but he still maintains some of its original detail. And the arch detail of the J.P. Dodge building is nicely preserved on Paddington Station. Ashland homes designed by Clark also reflect the diversity of style. Clark was hired around 1904 to add a second story to an original 1878 building. And it was then used as a clothing and dry goods store for many years. But in the 1940s, like many other buildings, it was modernized, and Clark's classical details were stripped away. So in the mid-1980s, an attempt was made to bring back the look of Clark's original design. Although original building materials were not used and detailing is not exact, the restoration effort was, like the Medford Hotel, a testament to the community's value of Clark's work. And although a number of buildings designed by Clark have been demolished, many do remain and have become part of the fabric of our everyday lives, helping to add to the sense of place of our home. And this is Frank Clark's legacy.